Hello, and thank you for joining us today on Workforce Institute Radio. I'm Joyce Maloney, Director of the Workforce Institute at Kronos, and today we're speaking with Human Capital Management Guru and CEO of Creelman Research, David Creelman, and noted industry blogger and consultant William Tincup, CEO of HR consultancy Tincup and Company. David and William, thank you both for being here today.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Today's topic is HR analytics that matter, and in a Workforce Institute spring podcast we did about making big data small, we cited an IDC stat that the worldwide market for big data and services is expected to grow to almost $17 billion by next year. Deloitte published some more specific research for our world of workforce management, stating that more than 60% of companies are investing in big data and analytics tools to help make their HR departments more data-driven. But while many companies are deploying HR analytics, Deloitte points out there are two distinct groups separated by a rather large chasm, the haves and the have-nots. Let's talk about how we can help our listeners be part of the haves group when it comes to HR analytics. So my first question is, since the term analytics can be intimidating and an overwhelming one, let's start the conversation in the most basic terms. What are the HR analytics being used in the workplace today, and which are the ones that really matter? And William, why don't we start with you on that question?
Sure. The thing is, you can measure anything and almost everything, and I think that's where HR sometimes it's when you look around and you talk to HR people today, they're almost overwhelmed with the amount of things that they could measure, and so I kind of always bring things back to its simplest form. Is like, what's important to the organization? Start with the business. What's important to the business? And things like productivity and attendance or engagement or communications or turnover, recruiting efficiency, things like that, or even retention. So the thing is you can measure almost everything. You can measure almost anything, but pull it back to what's the one thing that you really think the business needs to know out of the HR and or recruiting function. And it might be some of the traditional things that we've seen over the years, like cost of hire, time to fill, or quality of hire, things like that. But at the end of the day, it's not, for me at least, it's not a game of the 6,000 things on the dashboard that no one can keep track of. It's probably boiling it down to a manageable 4 to 7 things and keeping your finger on the pulse of those things to see how they're working, what is the temperature of the firm, how are we doing as it relates to these things. So I don't think there's a magical answer, Joyce. I think that's probably one of the harder things for HR pros is that someone can't come down from the mountaintop and say, measure this one thing and your organization will be great. It might be true in retail, not true in hospitality, or it might be true in hospitality but not true in healthcare. So I think the game is really, before you get overwhelmed with all the things, pull it back to, okay, at the end of the day, our business is really revenue-centric. Maybe it's a restaurant chain, or maybe it's a retail outlet or something like that. And we're really revenue. So maybe revenue per employee is the most important metric that one can measure. And so measure that first. And the only other caveat that I'd say is, before we go off and trusting all the data that we do have, we've got a bit of a reclamation project with all of our data, because we have disparate systems that don't necessarily talk with one another. And so I think that there's a little bit of a making sure that we have good data, cleaning our data, talking about data first, and then measuring and kind of creating a baseline of what we're looking at. And then over time, I think we can trust that data, whatever it is that we choose to measure. I think we can trust that data a little bit more and more over time.
So William, measure what matters and make sure that what you're measuring has integrity. I think those are two really key points with any analytics exercise. David, you've done a lot of work in this area, so what would you add to what William had to say?
Yeah, I would just frame up what William was saying, is reminding us that we hear this big topic of analytics and big data, and we think, oh, we've got to do analytics and big data. No, what we're really doing is we're running the business, and analytics and big data may be ways for us to run the business better. So he suggested talking about what is most important to the business. And let me give a simple take on that as well, is that really it starts with any kind of decision you need to make, and it's always about going from no data to some data. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go right to big data and big analytics. So just for example, if people are debating what employees really care about, what's going to affect retention, in maybe the old HR world, people would have strong opinions about what they think matters to employees. In the new world of analytics, we say, let's find out what data do we have about what really matters to employees. You may not have big data, you might just have little data, but taking the step to arguing from data instead of arguing from opinion, to me, is really the most important thing in analytics.
So David, I think you started to answer my next question, which is, why should an organization want to implement an HR analytics program, and are there certain sweet spot company profiles or vertical industries that are particularly ripe for this approach and the type of technology that you might apply to this approach?
Yeah, well, let me sort of continue on in terms of why you would want to do it. And to me, it's quite simple. It's better decisions because we know that humans are not necessarily that good decision makers. And if we can build some rigor into the decision making by looking at evidence, looking at data, we'll end up having better decisions. That's where the payoff is. If we say where are we most likely to have some areas that are really ripe for this, beyond the answer that we touched on the previous one, is that anywhere that really matters is a place that's ripe, and any decision where we can get some data as opposed to no data is ripe. But specifically, organizations that are big and where there's sort of homogeneity are great places for analytics. So, for example, if you have a whole lot of branches, so if you're a retail chain, you have all these branches, they have quite a bit in common, even if the people will quite rightly point out that a shop in Miami might be quite different than a shop in New York. Nonetheless, there's enough homogeneity that you can do analysis on that. If you've got large volumes of the same people in the workforce, like if you've got big call centers or big sales forces or big groups of technical support people, as soon as you have a big group of people, that also is a great place to start doing analytics because you can just get a lot of data.
And what do you think, William?
Well, things that come to mind are healthcare, because of their patient-centric, or should be patient-centric. So you look at data that you can get patient satisfaction, you can get performance data for nurses and doctors. You can kind of juxtapose those things together to look at, what's the health of the organization? How are we doing in terms of treating our patients well and having great success? You look at verticals that are kind of a little bit more customer-centric, like retail or convenience store, hospitality, food service, etc. There's an front that customers can give you data. So not just the revenue data that comes out, but things like Yelp and Urban Spoon and things like that. You can pull data, these external data sources, and pull those into the organization and juxtapose those against internal performance data, retail sales per hour, or last year against this year, and employee-centric retail data or revenue data as well. So I look at those two as kind of while I kind of lumped all of the retail, hospitality together and healthcare, I think that looking at those and looking at not just at the HR data, I think that's one of the things we definitely want to do is kind of pull together all of our HR data and make that a little bit easier for us to discern these systems. So you have your applicant tracking system, and you've got performance, and you've got workforce management, and you've got scheduling, you got all these systems. So first of all, we definitely need to get our own house in order. Fair enough. But while we're doing that, we should also be looking at external data that can come in and go against those data sources. And while that might not be in the next 3 months, that's definitely in our future.
Yeah, I mean, what you're talking about, William, is exactly where we're seeing the driving interest in workforce analytics coming from in terms of the folks that we work with at Kronos. And specifically, probably our most sophisticated customers are those who look at their employees, at their workforce, as a strategic advantage, not just a cost to be managed. And if you're going to create that linkage between the attitudes and behaviors of your employees and the outcomes of your business, then you need to marry that kind of operational data up with your human resource data to understand if in fact you are training and leveraging that talent that you have in your organization in the most advantageous way. So we're definitely seeing exactly what you're talking about. It's not the majority doing that yet. It's definitely a minority, I would say, but I think it's the folks who are trying to sort of push to the next frontier of business excellence, who are looking at that opportunity of marrying employee and business outcome kinds of data. So William, I have a following question, and that is, what do you think are the types of baseline skills that an HR professional or business owner needs to possess before diving into an analytics project?
Well, I definitely don't want to say before, because there is no perfect time, and I think that's the kind of a misnomer in the industry, is that you get perfect and then you can do this. It's never going to be perfect. It is a relentless pursuit, and I think that we don't have that in HR. I won't speak to business owners, but to HR we don't have the skills that are really coming our way, and how our positions are changing, and that's STEM. I mean, at the end of the day, it's stats, it's math, it's code, it's learning how to code, it's data structures, it's Excel, it's pivot tables, it's all the stuff that we're not that great at. I mean, it's also, so the bad news is we're not great at it, and it's probably even worse that SHRM, our national organization, really isn't addressing it. When we go to conferences, we're not really getting smarter about it. So really the vendor community, like a lot of times, the vendor community is coming to the table and educating us insofar as bringing our knowledge forward. Now, that's the bad news. The good news is all this has happened before, and it's happened in marketing. So 15 years ago, marketing went through the exact same transformation that HR is going through. They're very art-centric, if you will. When you talk to a marketer 15, 20 years ago, it was Beret, it was Clove cigarettes, it was Manet versus Monet. It was art. It was very, very, very art and very little science. And the people that would talk about return on advertising were really cast out of the marketing discussions as hooligans. Now, if you fast forward, you can't find a marketer that can actually have a decent art discussion. Most of them are very comfortable with Excel. They're very comfortable with analytics. They're very comfortable with metrics. And it's because the industry changed. They adapted. So the good news for HR and recruiting, so we need to also talk about recruiting, brothers, is that there is another silo that went through the exact same transformation. And what we can learn from that is we will survive and we will get better, but we have to actually understand that our skills are completely outdated and that we have to go and kind of learn a new way of working. And it's going to be a little bit more STEM-centric, if you will.
So, David, what do you think about that?
Yeah, largely I agree with William, and you might divide the world into two types of people. People who come out of some kind of generally quantitative background versus those who have no quantitative background at all. And I thought the example is actually a very good one, and pivot table. Check it out. If you find, oh yeah, I get it immediately, I see what this is doing, then you're the kind of person who has kind of the baseline skills to begin doing analytics. If it's the kind of thing that blows your mind, then you're probably not on the path to taking a lead on HR analytics. And so it's a lot of fairly basic things in terms of not this highly advanced skill set. It's more about being comfortable with numbers. I think being comfortable with data. This kind of thing comes to you fairly naturally. It probably comes to you fairly naturally because it's something you've had an interest in. You develop your skills over the years. There's a whole other level of capability which goes way beyond pivot tables, and those are people who probably have a PhD in statistical analysis and know about things like structural equation modeling and so on. So you may need access to those kinds of people, real data scientists, at a certain point if you've got a big function of people doing analytics. But as I said earlier, the really important step is going from no data to some data, and the really important thing is going from people who have no comfort with numbers at all to have people who can crank out a pivot table in Excel, and that's where the bulk of the early wins are going to be. Just to expand on the question and getting away from the sort of technical skills, let's remember that somebody who understands how the business really works and the intricacies behind the numbers, that's really, really important. If you just bring in some PhD and let them loose on your data and they don't understand the business, chances are they'll come up with nonsense.
Yeah, I think that's right on. I mean, even when you do bring in the data scientists, they're still heavily reliant on people who are close to the business to interpret the data that they come up with. And I like what you said before about, sometimes the answer is just going from no data or low data to more data, that everybody doesn't have to have some kind of Star Wars dashboard in order for that to count as analytics. So David, let me follow on with you. What do you think is the hardest part then about implementing HR analytics?
Yeah, well, at the opening of the podcast, William actually gave us the answer. It's getting clean data. It's integrating the data from your HR systems with your business systems. So data is the foundation, and because data hasn't been so important to HR before, other than things like payroll, we haven't put in place the processes and the systems to make sure we have quality data. So there is a lot of work ahead of us.
Well, and I think sometimes you don't even know that there's an issue with the data until you start, because the data that's optimized, because I would absolutely agree with you that we have all of these systems that have cranked out, millions and millions of terabytes of transactional data over time, and all of those silos of data are optimized for whatever it is they're built for. And then when you start to try and tie them together, that's when you begin to realize where there are some fundamental flaws in data, or it's just that linkages that are missing in one data set that may not be so important to that data set are incredibly important when you move over to another. And, we see that, for instance, I run an ongoing project at Kronos doing data analytics around the voice of our customer and how happy or not happy they are with Kronos. And I'm pulling data from a lot of different sources, but one of the things that we rarely have a good answer for is what exactly is this respondent's role in their organization, because the things that an end user of our products would feel is very important may not be quite so important to an executive, but I don't necessarily know who's giving me the feedback, the end user or the executive. And in many cases, frankly, there's actually no good way to go back and answer that question, other than starting yet another data cleanup initiative, so that we at least have better insight moving from this point in time forward. But that is the unsexy plumbing side of data analytics, but it's absolutely crucial to the foundation of a good data analytics program, I think.
And Joyce, what I wanted to, an example I find really helpful for people who haven't really thought about clean data is take a look at their own contact list. And they may think, yeah, my contact list is great. I can always find, somebody's name and address and email and all that kind of thing. But then you say, well, can you list all the people in Germany? And you think, oh, well, no, actually some of the fields I haven't filled out. Or actually I've got so-and-so listed 3 different times because they moved, and so then they're being counted 3 times if we just do a search on the account on the word Germany. I guess I'm going to have to clean that up. And there's all kinds of messiness in databases that doesn't matter if we're looking at it one record at a time, and does matter as soon as you start doing analytics. So think about your, I encourage people to think about their contact lists and the kinds of queries one might potentially do on that. As I say, such as how many people do I know in Germany, or how many people do I know in Europe, where you might realize, well, I've got all the countries coded, and maybe that data is clean, but maybe there's no easy way to search on Europe, which is a collection of different countries. And that's where you begin to realize, oh, yeah, how this data is. The data has to be clean. It has to be structured in the right way. I've got to know the kind of questions I'm going to be asking to know what data needs to be there. And you begin to realize just how complex something as simple as your contact list can be.
And I think you just hit on another key point about what can make it hard to get started is you do have to know what are the questions, what are the questions I'm trying to answer, because that has everything to do with how you're going to structure data to help answer them. So William, back to you. You led the call with saying, clean data and data integration and trustworthy data are all critical parts. Are there other parts that make it hard to implement HR analytics?
Oh, there's no doubt. You used a great word a second ago in that linkages. And how do you know what the linkages are if you don't know what the linkages are? And it's in some ways it's solving. It's not just a Yogi Berra quote. It's solving for the CEO's dilemma of I don't know what I don't know. And so I think 2 things come to mind when you go down this process. One is it's a relentless pursuit. It's not a one and done. So if someone's looking for a magic bullet or an elixir that solves all the problems, I think they should probably stop thinking that thought. Analytics. Secondly, I think that it's layers of the onion. Like solve for something simple on the outside of the onion and start moving your way in and looking at those linkages. And there's a nice metaphor that we haven't used yet, and I think it's one that everyone can kind of get. It's going to the doctor. When you go to the doctor for a general checkup, what do? How do they assess your health, if you will? They take your blood pressure, they take your temperature, they check your pulse, they look in your ears, they look in your nose, they look in your eyes, and then they ask you a bunch of questions. And so, what we should do with the health of our organization, again, kind of watershedding from what are the business goals, is what are the key things for us to really be looking at? Because the linkages will make themselves known. If they're there, they'll make themselves known over time. If you have an idea of things that you'd like to draw out, I think that's great. I think that if you don't know that, it's okay. And there's a world of kind of dealing with ambiguity that I think professionally, I'm not so sure that we're really adept at dealing with ambiguity as it relates to data. Maybe people ambiguity, employee ambiguity, but as it relates to data, I don't know if we're really great at dealing with ambiguity. So that's yet another kind of a blockage or a hard part of rolling out analytics, is dealing with it. The data is not going to tell us what to do. Like, it's not just going to say, okay, it's red, yellow, green, here you go, and then your job changes. It's going to inform you in a way, but you're still going to have to take that under consideration and make a human decision. And I think that that's all of those skills that I just described, we're not ready for at all.
Well, thinking about another one of the skills that's necessary here, which is the actual presentation of the data. David Grillman Research recently came out with a report offering tips on presenting analytics to decision makers, and your research indicated that this final step is often done poorly. So what specifically about the presentation of analytics do you think is done poorly, and what can HR professionals do better to convince colleagues that that this effort is worth it and that there is gold to be mined in that data?
All right. Well, let me start off, and then William can correct any mistakes I make. What I see is that we just discussed all the hard work of cleaning the data, of trying to make sense of the data, integrating the data, applying skills like even something like using a pivot table that may not be a second nature to you. So sometimes we put so much work into getting the data and the analysis that we just end up say, okay, well, that's it, and here's the report. Management will know what to do with it. And the classic example of this is employee surveys, where by the time you've gathered the data and produced all the reports and cut it in various ways, you may have lost, may not have time and energy to think about presenting it, and you may have lost sight of what is it that we're supposed to do with this data at all. The other thing is just not the lack of time and energy, but if this work is being done by data nerds, they may be so interested in the data that they may have little interest in conveying it in a way that's going to really appeal to the decision makers, a way that's going to be useful to the decision makers, in a way that's going to grab their attention. Data nerds may be very happy saying, and here's 6 more slides of our spreadsheet, and to them it's interesting. It's not interesting to the audience. So that's basically the issue, is that this whole what do we do once we've done the analysis, how do we turn that into action, is can be overlooked, and as a result we miss that final step. The answer, in as much as there is a simple answer, is to pay attention. What are we really trying to do? What do these decision makers really want from us? What's going to help them make a decision? What's the so what of all this data? And if we don't know if what the so good is, that's a good signal that that something's gone wrong in the analysis, because we should always be driving towards a so what. And getting back to one of William's early points, we want to be solving an important business issue. So there's got to be something on our mind, that the question we're trying to answer, a hypothesis we're trying to verify when we start going through the data. And hopefully, if we've kept the why we're doing this in mind from the very beginning, when it comes time to make the presentation, we're very clear about what the so what is and can articulate it.
So, William, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I think David's nailed it. I think that at the end of the day, one of the mistakes that we make is we try to do too many things in our rendering. And I think if we simplify that by just saying, here's the one thing you should look at. When you look at this rendering, here's the one thing I would like to call attention to. And I think that, again, I think that's a skill that's teachable, that I think that people, they might not have popped out of the womb with it, but I think that people can be taught how to look at data and then draw out, here's the one thing, or maybe two things, but here's the one thing I'd like to call your eyes to, and here's what I believe it tells us, etc. So there's the simple, and I used to get frustrated with employees that would just describe a problem. So they would come to me and say, hey, we have a problem. It's like, great. Thank you for describing the obvious. I need you to actually not just tell me the problem, but tell me a couple different ways that you'd solve that, and then pick one. But go through that analysis pretty quickly. And I think that, first of all, the one thing, just solving that and not trying to solve multiple things within one rendering, I think is useful. Second thing is, it should stand on its own 2 feet. The rendering itself, without you and your explanation of what someone should see, should be self-evident to someone that looks at it without you. It's almost like art. I used to get frustrated with artists that would the titles of their works were so descriptive that the person didn't have to think. They could stand in front of a painting and go, yep, I know exactly what this is about, because the title has described exactly what I should be feeling and thinking, etc. And I think that with this, it should stand on its own 2 feet. The rendering itself, you should be able to put it in front of another executive, and they should see it and go, yep, totally get it. Great. Now what? And then now you're moving into action at that point.
Yeah, you mentioned before, William, how marketing has morphed from, perhaps more of a creative-driven profession to more of a metrics and evidence-based profession. And I think this is another area where HR can take a page out of the marketing book, because you do need to make the story very clear and succinct. And to your point, I think that is the problem a lot of the time with when you have a ton of data and you have the tools to digest a lot of data, you run the damage of just dumping a very detailed problem on an executive's doorstep. And I think the long bemoaned HR problem of, how do you get the seat at the table? It's to arrive at the table not only with that very detailed description of the problem, but, what is the 1 to 3 headlines about, and this is what we can do about it. Because that's the power of the analytics, when you can make a data or an evidence-based proposal and move along to action, as opposed to spending a lot of time debating the data. So I think we're all in violent agreement on that one. My last question, and I'll ask you, William, first on this one. So once you have convinced your management that your findings are sound, what do organizations then do to put the data into action?
The best advice that I can give is test. And don't do anything that thinks that is carved in concrete or marble. That all these decisions, first of all, I like starting with communication. So you already it was assumptive. You're sitting around a table, you're all looking at the data, you recognize what you see, you all have agreement, and then you test. It really is a little bit of scientific theory. It's a hypothesis. Here's what I believe we see. Here's what I believe the course of action should be. Let's test that. And if it doesn't work, let's understand that we can make another decision based on other data, and it's okay. And I think that, again, I don't think that the profession is necessarily ready for the ability to test and try and fail. Because I think that what you're going to get is you're going to get a lot of people looking for the magic bullet, that the data said this, and when they go out and take the action, whatever it is, and it doesn't work out, then they're going to not trust the data. And really, I don't think it's about the data. I think it's about making decisions and about forgiving one another for trying something and failing at it and learning from it. And I think that that's the better organization that says, yeah, we're going to keep testing and trying things. Again, ripping a page out of the marketing handbook. Marketing is nothing but testing. You just throw things against the wall, and if it works, you keep trying new things. It's A/B testing. It's constant and evolving and revolving A/B testing. You try something, it works, great. You try something against it, it doesn't, you move on. And you keep trying, and I think that's one of the things that we're going to have to do in HR is based on this data that comes out and what we're looking at, we're going to make some assumptions. And some of those are going to be right, fantastic, and some of those are going to be absolutely wrong. And I think we've got to get comfortable with that.
And so, David, bring us home. What are your concluding thoughts on what does it take to move forward from diagnosis to action?
Well, what's really struck me actually with this whole conversation, going right back to the beginning, we do see a lot of consensus amongst people who've been working in this area. And amongst the consensus is that even small steps focused on real issues is a big move forward. And furthermore, just as part of this big move forward is a recognition that, like anything, big data analytics, small data, doesn't provide a foolproof answer. It just simply helps us do what we were always doing, which is muddling forward a little bit better. So we have to, as William was saying, forgive ourselves and be willing to experiment and try things. As long as we've done the earlier steps of being focused on what problem we're trying to answer, of bringing some data as opposed to no data to the table, doing a good job of presenting it so it's understandable to people, not getting lost in the analysis because we love it so much. I think all those things lead us to a point where action it doesn't become a problem. It becomes sort of natural. Look, we've got to make a decision about hiring or where we're going to set up a store or how we're going to handle our compensation. Because we're now looking at data and analytics, we're able to make those decisions with a little bit more certainty than we would before. And so one carries on doing things in business like you always have, just a little bit better.
Yeah, agree. Well, thank you very much, both of you. It's been a pleasure as always. I hope our listeners will find this to have been a terrific and clear conversation about a topic that some people find kind of daunting. For those of you who are listening, thanks for joining us, and please visit us on the web at workforceinstitute.org, and please join the conversation by adding your comments to our discussion. Thank you very much.